Hello, this Vodcast is on urbanization and sustainable cities, and our learning targets are to explain how the population shift from rural to urban has affected the environment, and to explain how cities can become more sustainable. First of all, what is urbanization? Urbanization is the creation and growth of cities and their surrounding developed land. There is a general trend, both worldwide and the United States, that urban population is increasing both in number and in the proportion of the population. You can see here in this graph shows worldwide how the urban population is increasing and the world population is decreasing, and this is by overall population, and between 2005 and 2010 there were more people worldwide living in cities than outside of cities for the first time in history. The second graph over here shows more of a proportion. When our country was founded, it looks like only about 5% of the population was living in cities. We were a very rural country at that time, and now about 75% of our population lives in cities. Overall, each week the urban population increases by 1 million, and the cities are getting larger and larger. In 1985, there were 8 megacities, and a megacity is a city that has at least 10 million people. In 1985, there were 8 of them, and in 2013, there were 24 of them. We've also had the emergence of megalopolises. A megalopolis occurs when separate urban areas, separate cities, expand and the areas merge into each other. Like we live in one of those. It's an area that's sometimes called Bowash, and it's a megalopolis extending from Boston all the way down to Washington, D.C. Urban growth and urban poverty is increasing in developing countries, and we'll see more details on that later in this podcast. In the United States, we had developed something known as urban sprawl. Urban sprawl is low-density development around cities and towns, where the housing, shopping malls, and office buildings, they're loosely connected by multi-lane highways. And I'll show you some of that in Google Maps. And we'll start off looking at Manhattan. Okay, so here's Manhattan. Wait. I'm sorry, wrong Manhattan. Just a moment. That's Manhattan, Kansas. Okay, here's Manhattan. This is the Lower East Side, and here's downtown. Here's downtown Manhattan. It's a financial district. This is not urban sprawl. Everything's close together. There's plenty of mass transit. There are big apartment buildings. If you want to see a city with quite a bit of urban sprawl, I'll take you to Las Vegas. Here's Las Vegas. This here is the Strip. So let's say this here is downtown. We do see some high-rises, but these are all hotels. These are all, here's Caesar's Palace, so these are all hotel casinos. Now if we go a little further away from the Strip, notice over here we've got a highway. All of these here are residences. I don't see much in the way of apartment buildings. These are all single-family homes. And let's take a look at one of these places. Here's an example of how unsustainable this can be. Grass. This demands a lot of water. So this is something which is not all that sustainable. We've got a lawn like we have here which you can find here in New York, in the middle of a desert. I like what I see over here much better. Here we have a xeriscape. Here we got plants which are designed for the desert. So it's a much more sustainable approach. So Las Vegas, you see, is a very good example of urban sprawl. And on the sprawl meter, you see that New York has a very high number on it, which means there's very little urban sprawl. And Riverside, California has a great deal of it. how some cities, like say Los Angeles, which actually has gone up on that number recently, it used to be much, much lower because of public transportation. It used to be that people didn't drive everywhere. People didn't have cars. People got around mostly by trains. A lot of cities back then did have excellent public transportation systems. And when I was in the middle part of the century, the oil companies and the car companies, they got together and they made a fictitious company. And this fictitious company went around and they bought the private public transportation systems. Once they bought them, they started dismantling them. Eventually got caught at it and they were forced to stop, but by then the damage had already been done. So many cities ceased to have public transportation other than buses. And that helped bring that development of urban sprawl because people could only travel from place to place with a car. So that was one cause, and here are other causes too. There were lots of available land in the United States, and also the government guaranteed loans to veterans after World War II, and that helped kickstart the suburbs. Cheap gasoline, which we continue to have cheap gasoline, by the way, and government-funded highways encouraged the use of cars. One reason why we don't have such good train service here in the United States, like you go to other countries, like say Japan, they've got the bullet train, which can take you from between different cities in Japan as quickly as an airplane. We don't have that here, even though that technology was developed here, because the government doesn't want to fund it. Nevertheless, we are funding highways. And also tax laws encourage home ownership. For example, here in New York, we have the STARS program, where when you own a house, you don't have to pay as much taxes on that house as you would on property that you don't live in. And also, the zoning separates residential from commercial areas. There are areas that are zoned for residential, you'll only find houses there. The areas that are zoned for commercial areas, you'll only find stores. You have to drive from where you live to where you shop. It's not like if you live in Manhattan, where all you have to do is leave your apartment, go down the block, and you can go to the supermarket. Multiple jurisdictions, they rarely work together to plan out the urban growth. Each town, each village works on their own. Each city works on their own. Environmental impact of urban sprawl. Well, some causes we've already gone into, and just to sort of repeat and to expand on it, there's lack of or inadequate public transportation, and this forces people to drive everywhere. So therefore energy efficiency has decreased. It is a lot less efficient to have everybody driving in separate cars than it is to have the same people all on one train. And also people live in a much larger area than they would without the sprawl. The impact on land and biodiversity is that the habitats are fragmented and there's loss. When people are living in a much larger area, then that means there's more habitats that are affected, more habitats that are fragmented, and also there's a loss of farmland and rangeland. Now with water, there's an increased use of surface and groundwater because there's more people spread around to different areas, and that means there's also more pavement, which leads to increased runoff, and also increased flooding. The increased flooding can also be due to habitat destruction, in particular destroying the ecosystems that act like sponges with the water, like the wetlands. Increased water pollution because areas where people otherwise would not normally go, if it's not being developed, people go. Decreased natural sewage treatment, once again, by the destruction of the wetlands. The urban sprawl impacts the energy, the air, and the climate because there's increased energy use and also increased waste. When there's more cars, definitely increases the amount of energy. It also increases the amount of air pollution. You have many more cars rather than one bus or one train. That increases the greenhouse gas emissions, and that leads to enhanced global warming. There are also effects on the central cities. With urban sprawl, they're generally find is that you'd have a central city and then the suburbs that go around it. And the central city has a loss of businesses, which leads to more unemployment, and also that decreases the tax revenue that the cities have, and that makes a vicious cycle. There are advantages to urbanization. Cities are the centers of economic development, innovation, education, technology, jobs, industry, commerce, and transportation. And we live in a city which are examples of all of these. New York is one of the economic centers of the world. We have some of the top universities in the world. We've developed a technology center. There's a center of commerce. It's a transportation hub. People who live in cities also live longer and have lower infant mortality and lower birth rates than those who don't live in the cities. One of the reasons for this is that people who live in the cities have better access to health care, to family planning, to education, and to social services. Also, recycling is more economically feasible because there are more people around in a given area to recycle. You've got a higher population density in the cities that preserves habitats and biodiversity because they're not spread out different areas so that the habitats around can remain more pristine. And if the city has a good public transportation system, then energy is saved because more people are taking it rather than getting around in their own cars. There are disadvantages. Cities have huge ecological footprints because cities are not self-sustaining systems. They occupy 2% of the land, but they use 75% of the resources and emit 75% of carbon dioxide. If we take New York City again as an example, earlier in the year you visited one of the only farms in New York City, and that farm was up on top of a roof. There are no farms in Manhattan. Prior to the rooftop farms, there was one farm in Queens, and that was a farming museum, really. There's a lack of vegetation, and with fewer plants to absorb air pollution, there are fewer plants to give up oxygen, to cool the air, both by providing shade and also by the color difference. When you've got all these dark rooftops and pavement and stuff like that, that heats up the area. Like if you've ever been to Manhattan in the summer, you can be sweltering on Fifth Avenue and then just walk across the street and go into Central Park and the temperature drops 10 degrees. There are also fewer plants to provide habitats for ecosystems and also to give aesthetic pleasure for us. Cities have water problems, so you need a whole infrastructure to provide water. Flooding is a problem in most cities. Pavement prevents infiltration of the water. Also, cities frequently are built on wetlands, and where our school is, what is actually a destroyed wetland, and flooding has been a problem in the past. Our art room, back when it used to be an auto mechanics room, was once flooded, and the flood was so severe that it picked up a car and literally threw it through the wall into the hallway. A lot of cities are located in flood-prone areas because historically transportation was on rivers, so that means that cities were built on floodplains. In addition to that, many cities, including New York City, are built on the coast, and as sea level rises, flooding will become more and more of a problem, particularly as we get into major storms like hurricanes and nor'easters. Cities concentrate pollution and health problems. There's more pollution from vehicles and industry. When there's a lack of adequate sewage treatment, there's also nutrient pollution in the waters. High level of these pollutants result in sicker people. And there are changes to the local climate, as I alluded to a bit earlier. Urban heat islands develop. This is both from heat generation from the vehicles and from industry, and also through the absorption of sunlight through dark roofs. There's a positive feedback from this because as it gets hotter, more people will use air conditioning, and air conditioning make the surrounding area even hotter, which will make more air conditioning and more energy use. Now we come to developing countries. The challenges there are similar, but they are more intense because they lack the adequate resources to deal with it the way it can be done in the developing world. The picture you see over here is rush hour traffic in Jakarta, Indonesia. And the traffic congestion is a major problem because the road construction is not keeping pace with the increase in the cars. The picture that you see over here is in Nairobi in Kenya, which is in Africa, and that ditch there is an open sewer. And many cities in developing countries cannot afford to build modern waste treatment systems, and that leads to a lack of clean drinking water, which will of course lead to development of many diseases like cholera. 15% of the world's population live in poverty in developing country cities. They live in slums, which are legal housing, but they're inadequate tenements. They don't have all the amenities that you would come to expect. They live in shanty towns, and shanty towns are places where people build their own homes out of whatever's available. It could be sheet metal, it could be boxes. And also squatter settlements where people will live on land or in buildings without the owner's permission. Now we're going to shift gears and we're going to look at how to make cities sustainable. First, motor vehicles. There are benefits to having cars. You've got the mobility, it's convenient and comfortable transportation, it's a symbol of power, sex appeal, social status, and success. And the economy depends on making and maintaining motor vehicles and its infrastructure. Now there are problems with using motor vehicles. Accidents have killed more Americans than all the wars in U.S. history. 40,000 people per year die in car accidents. Motor vehicles are the largest source of outdoor air pollution. 30 to 60,000 people die sooner than they otherwise would per year in the United States, according to the Environmental Protection Agency. Motor vehicles are the fastest growing source of carbon dioxide emissions. Also, the average American spends 38 hours per year. That's the equivalent of one entire week at work stuck in traffic, and that costs $800 a year in wasted gas and time. Here are some strategies on how to reduce car use. Full cost pricing. Remember earlier when we were in the units on conventional energy and sustainable energy, we kept saying that the market price didn't reflect the environmental costs. Use full cost pricing when it comes to gas. Put in a gas tax that covers the harmful effects of the driving on the environment. And then use that revenue to finance alternatives, finance public transportation, finance the light rail system. For full cost pricing, that would mean that gas would cost about $12 per gallon, which is profoundly more than what it costs now. And if it costs that much, believe me, people would use their car a lot less than they would otherwise. But of course, we all know this probably will not happen anywhere in the conceivable future United States because there's such strong public opposition to this. Also, fast, good, inexpensive alternatives are not available, and urban sprawl has made people dependent on cars. Most places, the only public transportation that they have is a bus that only goes to a few places once in a while. Parking fees and tolls. And if these fees and tolls are high in congested areas at congested times, people will choose alternatives. London has a $49 per day fee on gas guzzlers. Non-gas guzzlers don't have that fee. In New York, Bloomberg did try to have a congestion fee, but that didn't fly. However, all taxis are hybrids, and many streets do have bike lanes, and we now have bike stands with bike rentals which are readily available. Also, car-sharing networks are available where people don't have to own a car. They will join a membership and they can reserve a car in advance, or they can be directed to the closest car. And they bill monthly for the time that they use the cars. Many cities, including New York City, where it's the Zip car, have this. And the monthly fee for the Zip car is $6 a month. There are alternatives to cars. Bicycles. The advantage of bicycles is that it is affordable. There's no pollution, it's quiet, it's easy to maneuver, and it requires a very small parking space. Disadvantages is that there's little protection from injury and the weather. It's only good for short trips, though some people will go further, like my uncle, who's a nuclear physicist. He lived in Berkeley, California, and he worked at Stanford University, which was 50 miles away, and frequently he biked it. Biking can be tiring for some people, and bikes can very easily be stolen. I'll tell you that I once had a very weird experience. I took my bike to school, I locked it up to the bike rack, and when I came out, my bike was there, but the bike rack was gone. There's also mass transit rail. We have this in New York City, and it's found in many other cities. There are two types. There's the heavy rail, which is what we have in New York City, where we've got the subways and the elevated train. There's also light rail, which are trolleys, which we don't have in New York City. There are advantages. It uses less energy. There's less air pollution. It requires less land than cars. There are few injuries and deaths, and it reduces congestion. There are disadvantages. They are expensive to build and maintain. They're only cost-effective in densely populated areas. Commits riders to the train schedule, and there is noise pollution, as anyone who lives near an elevated train can tell you. With buses, advantages to that is that they're easily rerouted if there's a problem. They are inexpensive to develop and maintain. They greatly reduce car use and air pollution. Disadvantages are that they can lose money because in order to get people to ride the bus, the fares have to be low, and the low fares may not be enough to maintain the buses. Buses can get caught in traffic. Like, remember when I was living in Riverdale, which is in the Bronx, they had an express bus that would go to downtown Manhattan, and it always got stuck in traffic, so I rarely ever took it. It was no point. It was much quicker for me to take the train. Buses are noisy, and they commit riders to the bus schedule, which the buses don't always keep. And there's rapid rail. And rapid rail is something which we don't have in the United States, though they are planning to develop it in California. There are plans to develop it between San Francisco and Los Angeles. This is a high-speed train, travels 190 miles per hour, and it's a train that takes you between cities. My nuclear physicist uncle used to frequently take that when he traveled between Paris and CERN in Switzerland, and CERN is a major research facility in nuclear physics. And he took it. One is he loves trains, and the other is that time-wise, it's just as quick taking the train as taking the plane. So the advantages are it reduces travel by car and by plane. It's ideal for trips of 120 to 620 miles, and it's very energy efficient. Disadvantages are that it's expensive to run and maintain. You can only use it along heavily used routes. So that would work here in the east on the Boston to Washington route, though so far we don't have that. And there's noise and vibration. Smart growth is a way to grow cities. It's recognized that urban growth occurs, but urban sprawl doesn't have to occur. It uses various tools to channel growth where it can cause less harm. And here's how smart growth works in New York City.
On Earth Day 2007, Mayor Bloomberg announced Plan YC, which is the city's long-range plan and sustainability initiative for New York. The idea was, what are we going to be able to do to ensure that we continue to grow and thrive in the years ahead? And that had some important implications for how we plan and design our city.
You know, cities have to lead by example. We are the problem. We're where the people live. We generate 80% of the greenhouse gases, so we can't just sit around and wait for others to do it.
We are now at 8,400,000 people, and we expect to grow to 9.1 million people by 2030.
I think that New Yorkers are really hungry for public space, and so to be able to provide that, I think, is a huge quality of life improvement for people who live, work, and play here.
So our job is to look comprehensively at land use in the city. And that means rethinking mobility, providing alternatives to the automobile, and creating access to everyone for jobs, housing, work, through a bikeable, walkable city.
The world that we occupy every day is designed. For the most part, we're not in the natural world, but it hasn't always been designed with human behavior and human health in mind.
Actually, designers have some influence on that. And we'd always been in the business of making things more convenient and less mobile, and more elevators, and so people had to do less. The health department worked with us, say, well, we ought to change that thinking. Let's try to get people moving more.
Any change in the design of buildings or streets or neighborhoods, which makes it easier for people to simply walk, is going to be health promoting for the entire population.
We have actually invested and put down on the streets of New York in the last 3 years alone 250 miles of on-street bike lanes. And what we've done is taken innovative designs borrowed from other cities and implemented them on the streets of New York. So for example, on 8th and 9th Avenue in Manhattan, we actually flipped the traditional bike lane and the parking lane. That investment strategy alone has paid huge dividends on the safety front. In fact, every single time we put down a protected bike lane, we see injuries for all users go down some 50%.
One of the goals of Plan YC was to provide a recreational open space within 10 minutes of every residence, because it's been pretty much established that if people have a small park, and it doesn't need to be large, any open recreation space within 10 minutes, they will use it.
We have 6,000 miles of streets in New York City, and I look at our streets as some of the most valuable public space. So Mayor Bloomberg asked us to see what we could do to improve traffic. And what we did was take a look at who's using these streets and how are they using them. And as it turned out, in Times Square, 90% of the pedestrians that were there were only given 10% of the street space, and yet 90% of that space was allocated to cars.
There were a lot of tourists here before too, but there was a lot more traffic going down. So this is a very different view. It's very nice.
So once we flipped that and actually made that area safe for pedestrians, we were actually able to improve the flow of traffic. We were able to create a world-class space for people to enjoy the Great White Way. People don't go to Times Square to watch the traffic. People go to Times Square to enjoy the incredible lights, camera, action that's there.
Even in the 20-odd years that I've lived here, become a much more walkable city. There are now plazas and street trees and bike lanes and sidewalk cafes that have emerged over the last decades.
The 5 boroughs are very different, and we want to grow in those neighborhoods without changing their character. And the goal, of course, is to create complete neighborhoods, neighborhoods of choice, where you have jobs, housing, open space, retail, within a walkable, bikeable distance.
What works here in many cases, not all, but in many cases will work elsewhere, and we'd love to have people copy us in the same ways we'd love to get their ideas and apply them here if applicable.
What do we need to do to ensure that a 9 million person New York City is better than an 8 million person New York City is today? It's an iterative process. We are constantly searching for the great ideas that other cities have, and so I think it's wonderful that cities are coming together to say, how do we make our cities as great and as green and as sustainable as they can be?
Sustainability is something that makes fiscal sense, and it makes sense for our lives going forward. The air we breathe, the water we drink, the future we leave our kids.
Your view of those various tools can turn one-way streets into two-way streets. That makes the streets much more pedestrian friendly. Regularly occurring public events. For example, in Union Square in the city, they have a farmer's market once a week, and that will attract people coming into the city. It makes the area much more livable. Create more land for development. Various ways you can do it. Move highways underground. When they built the World Trade Center, they took all that soil that they excavated, used that to expand Manhattan, and they built Battery Park City on top of it. Make underutilized public land available for private development. Every city owns land, and there are areas of land which aren't being used all that much, and just make those available for private development. Consolidate regional economic development partner organizations into a signal downtown location. An example of development partner organizations would be things like the Chamber of Commerce. And if you put that together with the government structures into a single location, that makes more sense for people visiting it, more logistical sense, everyone's all together, rather than having them all scattered about and some of them on top of a bodega or something like that. Create a permanent public market that would attract a lot of people. Opening a campus of a local university downtown, where you could take a state university and have them have a satellite campus downtown. That will greatly increase the diversity and will bring a lot of culture there too. Building streetcar lines connecting downtown to urban neighborhood, and that will spur development. Streetcar lines aren't just ways to get from one place to another, but people will build stores, build shopping malls along places where it's easy for people to travel. And building a streetcar line will spur development along those lines and will help bring up those urban neighborhoods and will also bring up the downtown area too. Building downtown playgrounds will make the downtown area much more family friendly, which is something that a lot of downtowns, including New York City, frankly, has to work on too. I will tell you that when I lived in the Upper West Side, lots of people were there who were single. Most of them who were single, once they got married like me, we left. Why? It's just frankly not affordable to live with a family in Manhattan. Create a downtown entertainment district. Once again, that's another way to make downtown much more livable. Establishing a parking maximum will help encourage people to take public transportation in, and establishing a bike share program like what we have in New York City, where scattered throughout the city there are bike racks with bikes there with vending machines. You put in money and then you rent a bike and you return it to another bike rack someplace else. This can be something that's run by a private company, or it can be something that's run by the city government. Bottom line in smart growth and making cities more sustainable is that the problem is not urban growth. The problem is the failure to make the city sustainable and livable. Now we come to our concluding questions. Number 1, what is urbanization? Number 2, why did urban sprawl develop in the United States? Number 3, how does urban sprawl affect the environment? And number 4, describe 2 tools to make cities more sustainable. That concludes this podcast, and I'll see you in class tomorrow.